People who have survived a murder attempt by sheer twist of fate. What's your harrowing tale? Here I was, a trained professional whose job was to assess and mitigate danger. Yet I had walked straight into a lethal situation with all the naive confidence of a rookie. Sometimes the most dangerous situations aren't the obvious emergencies, not the drowning victims or the heart attack patients, but the seemingly routine calls that mask deadly intentions. The experience taught me that even those trained to save others need to remember their own vulnerability, and that sometimes the biggest threat to a rescuer is their own sense of invulnerability. Story 18. The low-income housing projects loomed like concrete mountains against the urban sky, their weathered facades holding countless stories of struggle and survival. In my late teens, driven by the reckless confidence of youth, I would venture into these modern-day labyrinths to score weed from whatever dealer was available, a dangerous game of Russian roulette played with strangers' trustworthiness. On this particular day, we connected with a dealer who went by 40, a name that would come to mean more than just another anonymous face in the projects. We handed over our money, and he disappeared inside one of the identical buildings, leaving us waiting in our car like sitting ducks in a shooting gallery. The universe has a twisted sense of timing. As we waited, a group of white guys, their faces hard with determination, pulled up beside us. The air crackled with tension as they pointed a gun at my friend, their words dripping with menace. If you've got money for weed, you've got money to pay us back. The barrel of the gun seemed to grow larger with each passing second, and I was convinced we were about to become another statistic in the project's violent history. Then, like a scene from an urban fairy tale, 40 emerged from the building. But he wasn't just carrying our weed. He appeared wielding a significantly larger firearm than our would-be attackers. The tables turned instantly. Our potential murderers transformed into retreating shadows, their bravado evaporating in the face of superior firepower. What followed was surreal. Instead of simply parting ways, 40 invited us to his apartment to smoke a blunt and calm our shattered nerves. There, the layers of his humanity revealed themselves. This wasn't just another dealer in the projects, but a father working the only angle he could find to provide his 6-year-old daughter with a better life. That summer took an unexpected turn as I found myself occasionally babysitting his daughter, witnessing firsthand the complex reality of life in the projects. Here was a man society would label a criminal, yet he used his illegal earnings to create opportunities for his child, and had likely saved our lives with his timely intervention. I often wonder about that little girl, hoping she managed to find the better life her father risked everything to provide. And I hope 40 himself managed to stay safe and out of prison, though I know the odds were stacked against him. The experience taught me that in the projects, nothing is as simple as it seems. Heroes and villains often wear the same face, and salvation can come from the most unexpected sources. Story 19. The sunset painted the sky in deceptively peaceful hues as I pedaled my bike homeward from a friend's house. At 10 or 12 years old, I was still innocent enough to believe that danger only existed in the stories adults told to scare children into obedience. That illusion was about to shatter like autumn leaves under wheels. The first sign was subtle. A car parked in the abandoned community pool's lot, its lone occupant a dark silhouette behind the wheel. Something about the stillness of the vehicle sent a whisper of unease through my mind, but I dismissed it, continuing my journey through the gathering dusk. As I cut through the elementary school parking lot, that whisper of unease grew into a murmur of concern. The same car had appeared at the bottom of the lot, its presence too deliberate to be coincidence. My heart began to quicken its pace as I watched it back away, but the relief was short-lived. When I approached the teacher's parking lot, the murmur of concern became a scream of alarm. There were those same headlights again, peeking around the corner like predatory eyes in the growing darkness. The game of cat and mouse had become undeniable, and I was clearly the mouse. Survival instinct took over. I turned my bike around and began pedaling in the opposite direction, only to see the car begin its slow, deliberate pursuit. In desperate need of sanctuary, I discovered some bushes and concealed myself within their shadows, watching with held breath as the vehicle cruised past, its driver clearly searching for his lost prey. The passage of another car forced my stalker to move, creating a window of opportunity. I seized the moment, racing up to the street and darting into a random open garage like a rabbit diving into its burrow. My heart thundered in my chest as I crouched in the darkness, praying for safety. When I dared to peek out, the coast seemed clear. Hope flickered briefly, only to be extinguished when I made my dash for home. There he was again, turning the corner, his vehicle's predatory presence now unmistakable. Panic propelled me onto a random lawn and up to a stranger's front door. In a moment of desperate luck, the handle turned. I burst into the home of an elderly couple, my sudden appearance startling them in their peaceful evening routine. Through gasping breaths, I tried to explain about the man trying to get me, but they seemed more bemused than concerned. From their window, I watched as my pursuer sat in his car, staring at the house with an intensity that chilled my soul to its core. Only when the elderly man rose to investigate did the stalker finally drive away. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to 10 minutes, I mounted my bike again and sprinted home, my legs powered by pure adrenaline. My parents, like the elderly couple, dismissed my story as childhood dramatics. It wasn't until years later, when I confronted them as an adult, that my mother finally understood the gravity of what had nearly happened. Her tears of belated recognition were a bitter validation of the terror I had experienced that day. Even decades later, I can still see that man's face with crystal clarity, his predatory stare forever etched in my memory. A reminder that sometimes the monsters of childhood stories were human faces and drive ordinary cars through ordinary neighborhoods, hunting for ordinary children on ordinary evenings. Story 20. Living above our business seemed like a practical arrangement until the night it nearly cost us everything. The witching hour, 3 a.m., brought an unexpected call from our alarm company, reporting motion detection in an unusual location. My husband and I, dulled by sleep and perhaps too accustomed to false alarms, assumed it was just another mouse triggering the sensors. That complacent assumption shattered the moment my husband came face to face with the intruder attempting to escape through a broken window. The burglar's eyes widened with the same surprise that must have been mirrored in my husband's face before he retreated back into the building's depths. As I frantically relayed our situation to 911, the building erupted into chaos. The sounds of destruction echoed through the structure. Crash, smash, bang. A violent symphony of desperation as the intruder sought escape. The noise painted a mental picture of wanton destruction, each crash representing another piece of our livelihood being damaged in his frenzied flight. What happened next defied all logic and self-preservation instinct. My husband, powered by adrenaline and righteous fury, pursued the burglar as he finally broke free. The chase led them outside, where my husband managed to tackle him to the ground, pinning him with a determination born of protecting everything we'd built together. I followed them out, still narrating events to 911, dressed in nothing but a tank top and panties, modesty forgotten in the heat of crisis. The scene might have been comical if it hadn't been so terrifying. Then, like a twist in a horror movie, a minivan screeched around the corner. The driver's voice cut through the night air. "Get the F***CK off him, or I'm running your B***TCH over." It was the burglar's girlfriend and getaway driver, her threat carrying the weight of deadly promise. Before I could process the danger, she gunned the engine, aiming the vehicle directly at me. Time seemed to slow as I threw myself out of the van's path, my scream of terror piercing the night air. The burglar used this moment of chaos to break free from my husband's grip and dive into the van, which peeled away into the darkness. But criminals, like all humans, leave traces of themselves behind. In this case, the burglar had left a trail of blood from his struggle with my husband, enough DNA evidence to identify him. Combined with partial plate information from witnesses, both perpetrators were eventually caught and imprisoned. The incident left us with more than just property damage. It taught us that the line between ordinary life and mortal danger is thinner than we imagine, and that sometimes the most dangerous moment isn't the initial crisis, but the desperate attempts of cornered criminals to escape justice. Story 21. The party pulsed with life inside, but I needed a moment of quiet. At 15 or 16, I stepped out onto the balcony for a smoke with someone I'd been chatting with all evening. The night air provided a welcome respite from the stuffy interior, and the presence of another person already on the balcony didn't initially trigger any alarm bells. The conversation started normally enough, the kind of superficial small talk that fills the spaces between silence at parties. He mentioned his military service, though something in his tone seemed off when he explained his discharge. Then, with a casualness that belied his intentions, he pulled out a large knife and handed it to me. The weight of the blade in my hands felt wrong, but social conditioning kept me polite. I examined it briefly before attempting to return it, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease in my gut. That's when everything changed. In one fluid motion, he pressed me against the balcony's edge, the knife now at my throat, its cold steel kissing my skin. "Do you know why I wanted to join the army?" His voice had transformed, taking on a manic edge that sent ice through my veins. "I wanted to King kill people, man. People just like you." He punctuated his words with a disturbing slicing noise from his mouth, the sound mixing with my thundering heartbeat in the confined space of the balcony. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, he pulled the knife away and started laughing, as if the whole thing had been some twisted joke. I seized the moment to escape inside, grabbing my girlfriend and locking us in a bedroom. The night devolved into a nightmare as he, high on methamphetamine, began punching holes in the walls and attempting to break down doors. I spent the night clutching my own knife under my pillow, every crash and bang sending fresh waves of adrenaline through my system. The next morning, he acted completely normal, except for one surreal detail. He had cut his jeans into short shorts, as if the previous night's violence had never happened. Looking back, It stands as one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. The confined space of the balcony, the immediate threat of the knife, the unpredictability of his drug-fueled behavior, all combined to create a perfect storm of terror. Sometimes I wonder if his military discharge story was true, or if it was just another facet of his methamphetamine-induced delusions. The incident taught me that danger doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it builds gradually, like a pressure cooker, starting with something as innocuous as shared small talk on a balcony, before exploding into violence with devastating suddenness. Story 22. Childhood friendships can be complicated, especially when they involve siblings with special needs. Our neighbors had 3 children who matched our ages perfectly, creating what seemed like an ideal playmate situation. Their eldest, Peter, had Asperger's syndrome, and while his outbursts could be concerning, we'd learned to navigate around his moods, or so we thought. That scorching summer day, our mothers decided to treat us all to a refreshing afternoon at the nearby lake. The water sparkled invitingly, promising relief from the oppressive heat. Despite the presence of 2 lifeguards, their attention was more focused on their conversation than the children splashing about in the crowded pool. I was 8 at the time, playing with Peter's sister, who was my age, while Peter himself lingered nearby. For reasons that remain mysterious to this day, something in his demeanor suddenly shifted. The change was subtle at first, a darkening of his expression, a tension in his movements that I was too young to recognize as warning signs. Without warning, he pushed me off the wooden pole I was holding onto in the deep, roped-off area. I wasn't a strong swimmer, but pride had led me out beyond my depth. The first push sent me into a panic, water flooding my nose and mouth as I struggled to surface. Before I could regain my bearings, he pushed me under again and again. The world beneath the water was a terrifying alternate reality. The muffled sounds of other children playing, the distorted sunlight filtering through the rippling surface, the burning in my lungs as they screamed for air, all combined into a nightmare of helplessness. It wasn't until the 3rd aggressive dunk that I realized this wasn't play. He was trying to drown me. Something primal awakened inside me. Instead of fighting against the water, I used it to my advantage. I let myself sink, swam beneath him, and emerged behind him like an avenging spirit. Grabbing his hair, I used my legs against his back as leverage and forced his face into the water, holding him down until his struggles began to weaken. When I finally let him up, his face was a mask of shock and fear. He swam back to the shore, where he sat huddled, arms wrapped around his knees, rocking back and forth while his mother attempted to calm him. Meanwhile, my mother unleashed years of protective fury on the negligent lifeguards, her voice carrying across the water as she berated them for nearly allowing her daughter to drown on their watch. Later, when my sister and I confronted him, his response chilled us to the bone. In a flat, emotionless voice, he simply said, "I'm sorry. I didn't know it would be like that." The implication was clear. He had planned to drown me, but hadn't anticipated how it would feel to experience the same terror himself. The incident left me with deep psychological scars. To this day, I struggle with a profound fear of swimming, and even the simple act of showering can trigger panic when water touches my face. It was a harsh lesson in how quickly trusted playmates can become predators, and how the line between life and death can be as thin as the surface of water. Story 23. The gentle clink of dishes being washed provided a deceptively peaceful soundtrack to what would become one of the most violent moments of my life. My apartment, usually a sanctuary of solitude, was about to become a battleground where the line between victim and survivor would be drawn in blood. He burst through my door like a nightmare made flesh, his mind twisted by a toxic cocktail of meth and acid. His delusion was almost comical. He was convinced he had lost his glasses somewhere in my apartment. The absurdity of his claim might have been funny if not for the murderous intent in his eyes as he appeared behind me, his hands finding my throat with practiced precision. As consciousness began to fade, my peripheral vision caught sight of my roommate's acrylic bong on the counter. In that moment of crystal clarity that sometimes comes in life-or-death situations, I knew I had one chance. With fading strength, I grabbed the bong and swung it backward over my shoulder, connecting with his face. The impact shattered the bong, but seemed to have little effect on my attacker, the drugs in his system dulling any pain he might have felt. Desperation fueled my next move. I swung again with the jagged remains of the bong, this time feeling it tear into flesh. The second strike left part of his face hanging grotesquely, blood painting my walls, floor, and ceiling in a macabre Jackson Pollock. He fled then, leaving a crimson trail through the snow outside like some twisted version of Hansel and Gretel's breadcrumbs. Police later found him unconscious in a cemetery, his body finally succumbing to blood loss. He required transfusions to survive and was eventually charged with assault, breaking and entering, and attempted murder. 4 years in jail seemed a small price to pay for the trauma he inflicted, but at least I was alive to feel indignant about the lenient sentence. The incident left me with more than just memories. It taught me that survival sometimes requires us to embrace violence we never thought ourselves capable of, and that the will to live can transform even the most ordinary objects into weapons of salvation. Story 24. At 14, my world revolved around music and the dream of becoming a rock star. When I spotted a second-hand guitar listed at an irresistibly low price online, it seemed like fate. The seller attended my school, which added a comforting layer of legitimacy to the transaction. How dangerous could it be to visit a classmate's house? The guitar, though missing its strings, spoke to my teenage aspirations. The seller suggested we head downtown together to purchase new strings, a reasonable proposition that my inexperienced mind saw no reason to question. The familiar surroundings of our school neighborhood gradually gave way to less savory streets, but youthful optimism kept any concerns at bay. That optimism shattered when a stranger materialized from the urban shadows, his approach carrying an air of practiced intimidation. He demanded money, claiming ownership of the territory we were passing through. The cold metal of his handgun glinting in the afternoon sun transformed our mundane errand into a nightmare. I stood frozen, my mind struggling to process this sudden shift from normal teenage activity to life-threatening confrontation. The seller, however, surprised me by engaging with our would-be robber, his voice steady as he challenged the man's authority. In the midst of their heated exchange, he whispered one word that would save my life. Run. Instinct took over. I bolted through the street, weaving between moving cars like a desperate pinball. Each step was accompanied by the terrifying expectation of gunfire, my imagination already painting the scene of a bullet finding its mark. But the shot never came. The experience marked the end of my naive trust in the world's essential safety. A simple quest for a musical instrument had nearly cost me my life, teaching me that danger lurks in the most ordinary situations, waiting for youth and inexperience to provide an opportunity. Years later, I still wonder about that seller. Was he truly surprised by the encounter, or had he known about the danger and chosen to warn me anyway? Sometimes the line between friend and foe, like the line between safety and peril, proves remarkably thin. Story 25. Some scars are carved into our flesh before we're old enough to understand their meaning, and some betrayals run so deep they're written into our very DNA. My story begins in infancy, when my biological mother made a decision that would cast a shadow over my entire existence. She took out a life insurance policy on me. Initially, the policy might have seemed like responsible parenting, a safety net to ensure her child would be cared for in case of tragedy. But as time passed, her intentions twisted into something darker, like a beautiful flower slowly rotting from within. The $500,000 payout began to whisper seductive possibilities to a mind already prone to darkness. At 18 months old, I became the target of the very person nature designed to protect me. My mother's hands, which should have offered comfort and safety, instead became instruments of violence as she shook me with such force that my tiny brain swelled within my skull and blood vessels burst in my eyes. My father, though imprisoned at the time, became my unlikely savior. During a prison visit, his paternal instinct recognized something terribly wrong in his baby's appearance. He alerted the guards, setting in motion a chain of events that would save my life. I was rushed to the ICU while Child Protective Services launched an investigation that would eventually place me in my aunt's protective custody. But the story doesn't end there. My mother's time in prison did nothing to reform her predatory nature. Upon release, when I was 3, she attempted to beat me with a board studded with a protruding nail. Another attempt to cash in on the policy that had transformed me from a blessing into a potential payday. As I grew older, she continued her manipulative attempts to re-enter my life, each approach sending me into panic attacks so severe that the mere sight of her would trigger physical symptoms of trauma. To this day, I maintain zero contact, understanding that sometimes the most toxic danger comes not from strangers, but from the very person who gave us life. The knowledge that my own mother tried to kill me for $500,000 has left psychological wounds that no amount of therapy can fully heal. It's a stark reminder that sometimes the monsters in our lives don't hide under beds or in closets. Sometimes they sing us lullabies and kiss us goodnight, all while calculating the profit margin of our death. Story 26. Family homes are supposed to be sanctuaries, but that night, my brother's house became the stage for a nightmare. The household seemed normal enough, my brother, his wife, their 2 children, and my sister's daughter all under one roof. I was 16, crashing on their sofa after a late-night session of Gran Turismo with my brother on the PlayStation. The weekend before had seen a gathering of friends and family, marred by an uninvited guest who had tried to crash the party. The resulting confrontation had ended in his humiliating defeat and retreat, but like many wounded egos, his thirst for revenge would prove more dangerous than the initial conflict. That Thursday night, as I drifted off to sleep on the couch, I had no idea I was about to become the target of his wounded pride. My next conscious moment found me in the bathroom at 5 a.m., blood pouring from my head. the white porcelain of the bathtub slowly turning crimson. Reality seemed to skip like a scratched record. Suddenly I was downstairs again, staring at my reflection in the living room mirror, watching more blood flow from my wound. The scene around me was like something from a horror movie, blood everywhere, splattered across furniture, walls, and children's toys. The party crasher had returned with reinforcements. While his friend went upstairs to attack my brother, he had targeted me as I slept, using the claw end of a hammer with methodical brutality. In that moment of semi-conscious clarity, I had apparently kicked out, catching him square in the nose. His response still echoes in my nightmares. "That's the last thing you're going to do, you little bastard." The next clear memory was being back in the bathroom, as if my mind was trying to piece together a shattered timeline. The police arrived quickly, and the attackers were caught shortly after, having dropped their weapons and face scarves in their hasty retreat. They received 5 years each for attempted murder, a sentence that seems laughably inadequate for trying to cave in a sleeping teenager's skull. Not long after their release, one of them committed suicide. In a twisted way, it felt like karma had delivered a harsher sentence than the justice system. Unfortunately, it wasn't the one who had attacked me. He still walks free, while I carry the scars of that night, both physical and psychological. The incident taught me that sometimes the most dangerous moments come when we feel safest, and that violence can follow us home, turning familiar spaces into crime scenes. The PlayStation we had played hours earlier, the sofa that had seemed so comfortable, the bathroom where I tried to stem the bleeding, all became props in a real-life horror story, forever changing how I view the sanctity of home. Story 27. Mental instability can wear a deceptively normal face, as I learned during my time living next door to a man who would eventually try to kill me. He had a therapist for his mental health issues, and our arguments, while frequent, seemed like typical neighbor disputes, nothing that foreshadowed the violence to come. That morning, the tension that had been building between us finally reached its breaking point. Our voices rose in yet another argument, but this time, something in his eyes had changed. When he attempted to brush past me to reach my partially disabled mother sitting on the couch, every protective instinct I possessed flared to life. I couldn't let him near her. That much was crystal clear. What I didn't know was that he had concealed a pocket knife, waiting for this very moment. As I grabbed his shoulder and pulled him away from my mother, our bodies locked in a desperate struggle. I managed to secure the knife and landed several defensive blows, but victory was more costly than I initially realized. It wasn't until I felt warmth spreading across my stomach, like spilled water but too thick, too warm, that I understood I'd been stabbed. The human mind is a strange thing. Even as I asked my mother for a warm compress and called 911, I remained eerily calm, lying on the floor and applying pressure to my wound as I'd seen done in countless medical dramas. The surreal nature of the situation reached its peak when I glanced toward the kitchen. There he was, my would-be murderer, calmly fixing himself a cup of coffee, as if he hadn't just tried to end my life. The disconnect between his actions and his apparent serenity was perhaps more chilling than the violence itself. His composure finally cracked when the police arrived, genuine shock registering on his face as they threw him to the ground. It was as if he had been operating in an alternate reality where his actions made perfect sense, only to have that bubble suddenly burst. The aftermath revealed the full extent of his handiwork: a 6-inch laceration on my abdomen, a 3-inch cut on my ribs, and a 1-inch slice on the back of my right thigh. In a twist of dark humor, the doctors informed me that my belly fat had actually saved my life, stopping the knife from reaching vital organs. Sometimes survival comes down to the most unexpected advantages. The incident left me with more than just physical scars. It destroyed my sense of security in my own home and taught me that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones we see every day, the ones who can switch from fixing coffee to attempted murder without missing a beat. Story 1. Thank heavens for my vigilant neighbors. I used to resent their prying eyes until that fateful day changed everything. At the tender age of 10, I was carelessly pedaling my bicycle along our residential street during summer break, a simple pleasure my parents permitted within the confines of our neighborhood. Suddenly, an ominous van materialized across the street. Its driver, a stranger with malicious intent, beckoned to me with a deceptively gentle voice, inquiring if I'd spotted his missing dog and imploring my assistance in locating it. In my childlike innocence, I naively agreed, beginning to approach his vehicle. That's when Mrs. Thompson, our elderly neighbor, erupted from her house like an avenging angel, her shrill voice piercing the air as she commanded the man to leave immediately. The stranger hastily retreated into his van and vanished into the afternoon. It wasn't until years later that the true gravity of that moment struck me, how perilously close I had come to becoming another tragic statistic. Story 2. When I was approximately 10 years old, my grandfather lay dying from a devastating combination of cardiac complications and cognitive decline. Our relationship was virtually non-existent, my last encounter with him dating back to my infancy. My father, harboring deep-seated resentment, refused to accompany my mother and me on our hospital visit. Upon arrival, we found him in an apparently peaceful slumber. My mother leaned in close, whispering what I assumed were words of comfort about his condition. I hung back, unnerved by this unfamiliar figure who, despite our blood ties, might as well have been a stranger. Despite my visible discomfort, my mother gently insisted I approach and offer some kind words. Understanding the gravity of the situation reflected in her grief-stricken eyes, I suppressed my reservations and stepped forward, following her example. He appeared completely unresponsive, so I began whispering gentle platitudes. Without warning, his eyes snapped open, fixing me with a gaze of such pure, unbridled hatred that my heart nearly stopped. In one fluid, terrifying motion, he lunged upright, his gnarled hands closing around my throat with shocking strength. What followed was chaos. My mother's desperate screams for medical assistance while my grandfather maintained his vice-like grip, violently shaking me while roaring, "You betrayed me." Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. His grip slackened as he collapsed backward, the monitor's steady tone announcing his departure from this world. My mother was inconsolable, and I stood frozen in shock and confusion. Later, after the dust settled, a compassionate nurse explained to my mother that his severe dementia had left him barely tethered to reality, likely causing him to mistake me for someone else. Years later, my mother revealed her belief that he had seen my father in me, my father, who had been an abusive, alcoholic womanizer in my early childhood, earning my grandfather's eternal contempt. Apparently, my unfortunate resemblance to my father had triggered his final, violent act. Story 3. During the pulsating nightlife of 1990s Los Angeles, I worked as a bouncer at an upscale nightclub. One particularly fateful evening, I found myself in a confrontation with several gang-affiliated individuals who became hostile after being denied entry for refusing standard security protocols. After hurling various threats and warnings in my direction, they eventually retreated into the neon-lit darkness. As the night wound down and the crowd thinned, the combination of a slow evening and overstaffing led me to indulge in a few drinks. The alcohol, coupled with exhaustion, prompted me to seek refuge in the back seat of my colleague's car for a brief rest. Minutes later, nature called, compelling me to stumble towards a secluded spot between a security booth and the building's facade, approximately 25 feet from the club's entrance. In that vulnerable moment, as I attended to my business, a figure darted past me like a shadow, disappearing behind the security booth. Before I could process what was happening, the air exploded with the deafening sound of a 9mm pistol. Bam! 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 As multiple rounds tore through the very back seat I had occupied mere moments ago. The shooter, his face contorted with determination, spun around and sprinted past me, vanishing into the labyrinth of dark alleyways. The entire incident felt surreal, like a scene from a crime thriller. My friend, convinced I had been specifically targeted, avoided any contact with me for over a year, fearing association might mark him as the next target. Editor's note: this incident occurred in Los Angeles when I was 25, roughly 25 years ago. While some details may have blurred with time, I vividly recall my friend's genuine terror. He was convinced this wasn't a random act of violence or gang initiation, but part of a calculated conspiracy to end my life. For those curious about the vehicle, it was a weathered sedan, barely worth $500. The exact number of shots fired was later confirmed by witnesses in the neighborhood, though no formal investigation followed. Remarkably, this wasn't even my first brush with gunfire. Life has indeed been an unpredictable journey. Story 4. This account, which garnered significant media attention, is shared through a throwaway account for privacy reasons. As a criminal defense attorney, I've encountered my fair share of desperate clients, but none quite like this. I was representing a man who had orchestrated an elaborate embezzlement scheme, siphoning nearly $500,000 from his business partner. The walls were closing in around him. He faced several years in a federal penitentiary. His assets had been frozen by government intervention, and multiple creditors were circling like vultures, demanding over $2 million in restitution. As if his legal troubles weren't sufficiently overwhelming, he was simultaneously embroiled in a bitter divorce battle, complete with a restraining order that severed his connection to his children. The crushing weight of these circumstances began to manifest in increasingly erratic behavior. He turned to a toxic combination of heavy drinking and cocaine use, and my office began receiving disturbing late-night phone calls, sometimes filled with incoherent threats, other times dissolving into heart-wrenching sobs. One particularly tense morning, he appeared at my office unannounced. I was in court at the time, so my secretary received him, later reporting that he had been unervingly calm and polite. What we didn't know then was that this facade of composure masked a deadly intent. After leaving my office, he proceeded directly to his divorce attorney's office, and, in a moment of horrific violence, ended that lawyer's life. Law enforcement intercepted him shortly afterward, and he was wounded in the ensuing shootout. During his subsequent confession to the police, he revealed a chilling detail that still haunts me. He had come to my office that morning with the explicit intention of killing me as well. His murderous agenda had included not just his divorce attorney, but his civil attorney too, a calculated plan to eliminate all the legal professionals he blamed for his downfall. The random timing of my court appearance that morning had unknowingly saved my life, a realization that continues to send shivers down my spine. Sometimes I wonder how differently events might have unfolded had I been in my office when he arrived, his seemingly cordial demeanor masking lethal intentions. Story 5. Our childhood neighbors seemed picture-perfect from the outside, a family of 5 with 3 children matching the ages of me and my siblings. We formed easy friendships, our laughter and games creating a soundtrack to countless summer days. However, beneath this veneer of suburban normalcy lay a complex reality. Their eldest child, Peter, had been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, and his occasional outbursts could transform from concerning to terrifying in the blink of an eye. One sweltering summer afternoon, our mothers decided to treat us all, 6 children in total, to a refreshing visit to the local wading pool. The scene was typical of a hot day. The pool teemed with squealing children, while 2 lifeguards lounged in their elevated chairs, more engrossed in their conversation than their supervisory duties. I was splashing around with Peter's sister, who was my age, when something imperceptible shifted in Peter's demeanor. Without warning or apparent provocation, his usually distant expression morphed into something darker, more menacing. Before I could process the change, his hands, surprisingly strong for an 8-year-old, seized my head and forced it beneath the chlorinated water. The next moments were pure terror. The burning sensation of water flooding my nose and throat. The primal panic as my lungs screamed for air. The horrifying realization that despite my desperate struggles, I lacked the strength to break free from his iron grip. Through the wavering water, I caught glimpses of other children swimming nearby, oblivious to my fight for survival. Just as black spots began dancing in my vision, I saw my mother's face through the distorted lens of the pool water, her expression a haunting mixture of maternal fury and raw fear. The next clear memory I have is of Peter huddled at the pool's edge, arms wrapped tightly around his knees, rocking back and forth while his mother attempted to calm his agitated state. Meanwhile, my mother unleashed years of protective rage upon the negligent lifeguards, her voice reaching a crescendo as she berated them for nearly allowing her daughter to drown under their watch. The incident left indelible marks on my psyche. To this day, I battle an intense fear of swimming, and even the simple act of showering triggers anxiety when water touches my face. The experience taught me that danger can lurk in the most familiar places, and that sometimes the line between childhood play and life-threatening peril is terrifyingly thin. Story 6. The fluorescent lights of the gas station flickered ominously against the darkening sky as I pulled up to refuel during my undergraduate years. Little did I know that my broken car locks would lead to one of the most surreal and terrifying experiences of my life. The moment I settled back into the driver's seat, my world shifted dramatically. A stranger materialized beside me, his presence bringing with it the sickening weight of impending danger. With quiet menace, he forced me to drive to the nearest ATM, my body frozen in a state of primal fear that rendered all rational thought useless. What followed was a bizarre odyssey that seemed to exist in some twisted parallel universe. My captor, claiming employment at Wendy's, made the surreal promise of unlimited fast food in exchange for my generosity. He proceeded to share photos of his daughters from what was obviously a stolen phone, his actions swinging wildly between threatening and bizarrely paternal. The situation took an even more peculiar turn when Whitney Houston's voice filled the car's interior. My kidnapper's reaction was immediate and extreme. He dissolved into hysterical tears, screaming with unexpected philosophical depth. Why do all the good people have to die? Only bad things should happen to bad people. After withdrawing cash and surrendering it to him, I dared to hope the ordeal was ending. Instead, he commanded me to continue driving, our destination unknown. As we crossed railroad tracks, my mind raced with dark possibilities. Was this where my story would end? In a macabre attempt at conversation, he inquired about my studies. When I mentioned biochemistry, his response was jarringly disconnected. I believe in jet propulsion and all that sh*t. We are not alone. Aliens are among us. Finally, at another gas station, he delivered his bizarre farewell. Drive away, sweetheart. I immediately contacted law enforcement and later participated in a lineup where I discovered the chilling truth. This man had enacted similar scenarios with multiple women, some of whom had met far darker fates than mine. The experience left me with the unsettling knowledge that sometimes survival hinges not on skill or preparation, but on the inexplicable whims of a disturbed mind. Story 7. Betrayal wears many masks, but none quite as devastating as the face of a supposed best friend. My story begins in the warm glow of what seemed like perfect domestic bliss. My wife and I had created a life together that, to outside observers, appeared flawless. Too flawless, as it turned out, for my closest friend's fragile grip on reality. He had convinced himself that our marital harmony was an elaborate facade, a carefully constructed illusion masking something sinister. In his increasingly paranoid mind, I must have been secretly abusing my wife. No amount of evidence to the contrary could penetrate the dark narrative he had woven. That fateful evening started innocently enough. I had prepared a sumptuous dinner, and we were all enjoying ourselves, drinking, laughing, and taking turns at karaoke. The atmosphere was light, filled with the kind of joy that makes memories worth keeping. When I stepped into the kitchen to clear away some glasses, I had no inkling that my world was about to shatter. Returning to the living room, I casually leaned against the couch, my supposed friend positioned slightly behind me to my left. The sudden, sickening sound of glass meeting skull, "Thank," preceded the explosion of pain that erupted across my head. He had seized a whiskey bottle from the table and brought it down with savage force against my skull. Initial confusion gave way to horrifying clarity as blood cascaded down my face, instinctively trying to avoid staining our furniture. A bizarrely mundane concern in that moment of crisis, I stumbled toward the kitchen. Behind me, he paced like a caged animal, muttering incomprehensible phrases that seemed to justify his actions only to himself. My thoughts turned to my nearby firearm, but the severe concussion had left my mind clouded and uncooperative. Mercifully, he departed before the situation could escalate further, leaving me with a severe concussion whose effects still linger to this day. Now, I harbor only two significant life goals. The primary one remains private, but the second? To outlive him, if only to have the satisfaction of desecrating his final resting place. A desire born not of mere vengeance, but of justice long denied. Story 8. The night air bit cold against my skin as I made my way home from the train station at 18. It should have been a simple 10-minute walk, a journey I'd made countless times before. But that evening, destiny had scripted a different narrative, one written in violence and survival. The first indication of danger came as footsteps echoing behind me in the darkness. Initially, I dismissed them as another late-night traveler, but something primitive stirred in my subconscious, that ancient part of our brain that recognizes predatory behavior. As the footsteps grew closer, my pace quickened instinctively, and I found my mind racing through potential self-defense scenarios, though I never truly believed I'd need them. Then came the impact, a crushing blow to the back of my head that sent shockwaves through my entire body. But instead of fear, an unexpected emotion surged through me, pure, unadulterated rage. I spun around, my vision tinged red, and launched myself at my attacker. We grappled violently, our struggle a desperate dance of survival, until I found myself pinned to the ground. His hands found my throat, fingers pressing into my windpipe with murderous intent. I clawed at his eyes with the desperation of a cornered animal, but my efforts proved futile as consciousness began to slip away. Just as the darkness started to claim me, a crystal-clear thought pierced through the fog. "Wake up, or you will die." That thought triggered something primal within me, a surge of adrenaline that felt like electricity coursing through my veins. My eyes snapped open, and from deep within my chest came a scream that seemed to carry all the fury and defiance of life itself. I fought back with renewed vigor, my screams never ceasing, until finally, mercifully, my attacker retreated into the night. I lay there for a brief moment, heart pounding against my ribs, before sprinting home, my screams still echoing through the streets. My mother stood at the door, awakened either by my cries or perhaps by that inexplicable maternal instinct that senses when her child is in danger. The police arrived swiftly and apprehended the man that very night. What followed was a revelation that chilled me to my core. He had shot me in the back of the head, but by some miracle, the bullet had malfunctioned, lodging in my skull without penetrating. Even more horrifying was his confession. He had been stalking me for some time, waiting for the perfect moment to execute his twisted plan of murder, followed by necrophilia. Editor's note. For those questioning the authenticity of this account, Swiss newspaper articles exist documenting the incident in detail. Story 9. What began as an ordinary night outside a bar transformed into a nightmare that would alter the course of my life forever. I was with a friend, a trained medic, when we noticed a young woman lying motionless in a snowbank near a telephone pole, another victim of a hit-and-run driver. As we rushed to her aid, other bystanders were already calling emergency services, and I stood by to offer whatever support I could. In that moment of crisis, as we tried to help one stranger, fate dealt its cruel hand. The screams came first, sharp, desperate warnings that pierced the night air. As I turned, time seemed to slow, revealing a minivan bearing down on us with deadly intent. Most of our impromptu rescue party managed to scatter, but I wasn't fast enough. What followed was a display of calculated malevolence that still haunts my dreams. The driver didn't just hit me once. He orchestrated a methodical assault, reversing over my broken body, then driving forward again for a third pass. Each impact brought a new symphony of pain, each crunch of bone and tear of flesh adding to the horrific orchestra of violence. Later, we would learn the terrible truth. The driver, his mind clouded by a toxic mixture of drugs and alcohol, had been seeking revenge against the young woman's boyfriend. In his chemically induced rage, he had mistaken me for his intended target, transforming me into an unwitting victim of his misdirected vengeance. 9 years have passed since that night, but time hasn't erased the consequences. My life, once following a clear trajectory, was violently derailed. Every day brings a new battle with the physical aftermath of those few brutal moments. The medical bills pile up, a constant reminder of how quickly life can change. Editor's note: for those wondering about justice, an off-duty police officer witnessed the entire incident and recorded the license plate. The perpetrator was apprehended within 20 minutes and charged with attempted murder, among other offenses. Despite his lengthy criminal history, including a previous drunk driving fatality, he managed to secure a plea deal. The justice system, in its infinite wisdom, deemed 3 years of incarceration an appropriate punishment for nearly ending another life. The disparity between crime and punishment remains a bitter pill to swallow. Story 10. The local pool's lifeguard training course seemed like an innocent enough summer activity for a 12-year-old. 16 eager participants, ranging from pre-teens to late teens, gathered to learn the noble art of saving lives. Yet among us lurked a predator in plain sight, though we didn't recognize him as such, not at first. He was older than most of us, perhaps 16 or 17, and carried himself with an unsettling stillness that set him apart. Something in his demeanor triggered our primitive warning systems, that inexplicable sixth sense that whispers of danger. My friend and I found ourselves exchanging worried glances and nervous jokes, dubbing him the school shooter type. Our gallows humor masked genuine discomfort, though we didn't yet understand why our instincts screamed for caution. 2 hours into the course, we transitioned from pool instruction to classroom work, with a 20-minute break to change. The locker room should have been a safe space, but it became the stage for a nightmare. My friend and I couldn't help but notice his intense stare boring into us, his eyes holding something dark and volatile. We tried to avoid his gaze, but when my friend accidentally met his eyes, something snapped. His scream of "Stop looking at me" shattered the humid air as he produced a switchblade from his bag, lunging at my friend with murderous intent. The metallic clang of the locker door, deflecting the blade, probably saved my friend's life, giving him the precious seconds needed to sprint to safety. Then his attention turned to me, and time seemed to stretch like taffy as I fled through the labyrinth of bathrooms and showers, my feet slipping treacherously on the wet tiles. The sound of my pursuer's footsteps eventually faded, but the terror remained electric in my veins. Half-dressed and trembling, I sought help from the instructor, only to face shocking disbelief. He accused me of lying and bullying until we found my friend in the lobby, surrounded by concerned parents, sporting a 6-inch gash where the knife had found its mark. Reality finally set in for the instructor, who initiated an immediate lockdown and called the police. Our attacker had vanished like a phantom, never to return to the class. While I assume he was eventually apprehended, the resolution of his story remains a mystery to me. This experience taught me a crucial lesson: trust your instincts. That feeling of unease, that inexplicable sense of wrong. It's the voice of ancient survival mechanisms whispering warnings we ignore at our peril. Sometimes the monsters wear human faces, and sometimes they sit right beside us, waiting for their moment to strike. Story 11. The rhythmic clatter of train wheels against Eastern European rails should have been soothing, but that night it became the soundtrack to my nightmare. Financial constraints had forced me to ignore the warnings about women traveling alone in second-class compartments, a decision I would come to regret with every fiber of my being. The first mistake was choosing an empty 6-person compartment, creating an isolated bubble of vulnerability in the vast, moving metal vessel. The train's gentle swaying and the darkness beyond the windows created an illusion of safety that shattered at the next stop, when he boarded. His entrance brought with it the sharp stench of alcohol and an aura of barely contained violence. His eyes, when they found me, held a disturbing spark of recognition, though we'd never met. In his alcohol-addled mind, I had somehow transformed into his ex-wife, becoming the target of years of pent-up rage and resentment. The attack came with frightening suddenness, his hands reaching for me with desperate, drunken strength. Terror paralyzed my vocal cords, leaving me unable to scream for help. But fate, it seemed, had stationed guardian angels at this particular border crossing. The train carried border patrol officers from both countries. Through the open compartment door, a flood of uniformed figures burst in, their swift and coordinated movements speaking of years of training. Within moments, multiple pairs of hands pulled my attacker away, their presence bringing an abrupt end to what could have been a tragic story. The aftermath brought an unexpected glimpse into cultural justice. During the subsequent trial, one of the officers approached me with what seemed like a jest. "Would you like us to hold him down so you can strike him?" When I declined, thinking it a dark joke, their serious expressions revealed the genuine nature of the offer. They were deeply offended that someone from their country had attacked a young American tourist, viewing it as a stain on their national honor. Tourism, I learned, was a vital part of their economy, and my attackers' actions were seen as more than just a crime against an individual. They were an assault on the country's reputation itself. While the experience left me with physical and emotional scars, the swift action and protective instincts of the Border Patrol officers restored a measure of my faith in humanity. The incident served as a harsh reminder that danger knows no borders, but neither does human decency. Sometimes salvation comes from unexpected quarters, wearing uniforms and speaking languages we don't understand. Story 12. For 2 years, love and fear danced an intricate waltz in my life. I was a lead man at a manufacturing plant when she first caught my eye, a new hire whose presence brightened the industrial gloom. But beneath her surface beauty lay a darker reality. She was trapped in a relationship where drugs and violence ruled supreme. Every night, as we parted ways after our shifts, I would press the same words into her hands like a talisman. If you need help, call me. Anytime, day or night, I'll come. For months, these words hung in the air between us, until one night, my phone finally rang with her desperate plea for escape. I didn't hesitate. I drove through the darkness to rescue her, bringing her to the sanctuary of my home. But her ex-boyfriend, a man whose veins ran with methamphetamine and rage, wouldn't let go easily. For the next 2 years, we lived under a constant barrage of threats and harassment, each day wondering if it would be our last moment of peace. Then came the night that nearly proved fatal. Months after our wedding, my wife and I decided to venture out for a few drinks. By some twisted cosmic joke, her ex was at the same bar. Initially, it seemed like a miracle. He approached us with an apology, seemingly ready to bury the hatchet. The harassment, he claimed, was behind us. We sat outside, the cool night air filled with conversation and what felt like the possibility of peace. I should have known better. The next moment remains a blur in my memory. Suddenly I was on the ground, unseen hands crushing my windpipe with murderous intent. I fought back desperately, but my attacker had the advantage of surprise and position. As my vision began to darken around the edges, the infamous tunnel of light, growing ever closer, survival instinct took over. With my remaining strength, I managed to grasp my assailant's head and wrench them off me. My wife and I fled to our car, escaping into the night with pounding hearts and shaking hands. A week later, through my wife's careful inquiries in the community, the truth emerged. Her ex had paid 2 people $50 each to end my life that night. The casual nature of the transaction, the idea that my life was worth no more than $100, was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the whole ordeal. The experience taught me that sometimes the most dangerous threats aren't the obvious ones. Sometimes they come wrapped in false apologies and peace offerings, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Story 13. The Central American slum rose like a precarious mountain of desperation, built atop the city's massive garbage dump. Metal cylinders protruded from the ground like industrial stalagmites, venting noxious gases from the decomposing waste beneath our feet. This was where I found myself as a volunteer, navigating a world where poverty and survival danced a daily dangerous waltz. The narrow dirt path wound through this wasteland like a serpent, hemmed in by makeshift dwellings cobbled together from society's cast-offs. My fellow volunteer and I were making our way through this labyrinth when we encountered them. 2 men whose approach set off warning bells in my mind. Their movements were erratic, but I initially dismissed my unease, attributing their behavior to the consumption of rubbing alcohol, a common substitute for proper liquor in these parts, chosen for its affordability despite its brain-destroying properties. As they drew closer, one of them adopted an exaggerated friendliness that sent chills down my spine. He repeatedly attempted to drape his arm around my shoulders, his actions masquerading as the jovial behavior of an intoxicated local. But something in his eyes, a calculated gleam that contradicted his stumbling gait, told me this was no mere drunken display. I maintained a delicate balance, firmly but politely deflecting his attempts at physical contact while trying not to appear confrontational. This dangerous dance continued down the path, each step feeling like an eternity, until we finally reached a fork in the road. They took one path while we took another, and I felt the tension begin to ease from my shoulders. However, when we arrived at our destination and recounted our encounter to the locals, their response froze the blood in my veins. "Oh, everyone knows him," they said with casual familiarity that made the horror worse. "That's his technique. He acts friendly, puts his arm around you, then pulls out his knife and stabs you in the stomach." The realization of how close I'd come to becoming another statistic in this unforgiving environment hit me like a physical blow. My instincts had been right. What I'd interpreted as mere discomfort had been my survival instinct recognizing a predator's pattern. In that moment, I understood that in places where life hangs by a thread, death often comes wearing a friendly smile, and survival sometimes depends on recognizing the wolf beneath the sheep's clothing. Story 14. Sacred spaces are supposed to be sanctuaries, but that Sunday morning, our local church became the stage for a chilling reminder that evil respects no boundaries. The morning light filtered through stained glass windows, casting colorful shadows across the pews as my wife, our children, and I attended service as usual. None of us could have predicted how this peaceful scene would transform into a nightmare. Among the congregation that day was a ghost from my wife's past, a former romantic interest whose presence immediately cast a shadow over our worship. His behavior was unsettling. He seemed more focused on following my wife and our daughter around than participating in the service, his eyes holding an intensity that set off every parental alarm bell I possessed. When I confronted him, demanding he keep his distance, the sacred atmosphere of the church did nothing to temper his response. As we left, his voice echoed across the parking lot, calling out to my daughter in a way that made my skin crawl. My wife, recognizing something in his manner that I couldn't yet see, practically shoved me into our car, insisting we leave immediately. Later, I reached out to him on Facebook, hoping to resolve the situation civilly. His response was chilling. He claimed my wife and daughter were his friends, and that I had no authority to restrict their associations. When I threatened to involve law enforcement, he merely scoffed. The following Sunday, while I was at work, the true gravity of the situation revealed itself. Our pastor called me in a panic. The man had returned to the church, causing such a disturbance that the police had to be summoned. What they discovered in his backpack turned my blood to ice. A sawed-off shotgun, a methamphetamine pipe, and a quantity of the drug itself. The realization of what might have happened had I been present that day still haunts me. The church, with its peaceful atmosphere and sacred purpose, had nearly become the scene of unthinkable violence. The incident served as a stark reminder that evil can manifest anywhere, even in places we consider most holy. The contrast was jarring. In books and prayer cards sharing space with weapons and drugs, the peaceful Sunday morning congregation unknowingly sharing pews with a potential killer. Sometimes the line between sanctuary and danger is thinner than we'd like to believe. Story 15. The bustling streets of Johannesburg pulsed with life during rush hour, a symphony of car horns and human voices filling the air. At 19, I was navigating my old Golf through this urban chaos, the car packed with precious cargo, my sister and 3 friends. The setting sun painted the city skyline in hues of orange and purple, creating a deceptively peaceful atmosphere that would soon shatter like glass. The attack came with the precision of a well-rehearsed performance. 4 men materialized around our vehicle like shadows coming to life. Before I could process what was happening, one of them reached through my half-closed window with practiced efficiency. The world seemed to slow as his hand found the ignition, turned off the engine, and made a grab for my keys. "Phones and wallets now, or you die," he snarled, his words carrying the weight of deadly promise. In that moment, survival instinct overrode rational thought. I grabbed his arm, engaging in a desperate tug-of-war for my keys. He responded with swift violence, bringing something hard down on my arm once, twice. The second impact produced a sickening crack, and my grip failed as bone gave way. The group fled like smoke in the wind, and my friends leaped from the car in pursuit. Through a haze of pain, I spotted my keys lying just outside my door, a small mercy in the chaos. But when I tried to take the wheel, my broken arm refused to cooperate. I retreated to the back seat as one of my friends returned, his shirt now a canvas of crimson. He jumped into the driver's seat and navigated through rush-hour traffic like a man possessed. It wasn't until we were on the road that I noticed the blood. It was everywhere, painting the seats, windows, and my own clothes in grotesque patterns. The horrible truth revealed itself. I had been stabbed twice in the arm, the second strike severing all the tendons in my forearm. A roll of bandage in the car, another small mercy, allowed me to create a makeshift tourniquet as we raced 20 kilometers through the congested city streets to reach the hospital. Within an hour, I was in surgery. The doctors worked their magic, and I eventually recovered with a prominent scar and about 95% mobility. Constant reminders of how quickly an ordinary day can transform into a fight for survival. The incident left more than physical scars. It taught me that violence can erupt like lightning from a clear sky, and sometimes the difference between life and death comes down to mere centimeters and split-second decisions. Story 16. 2 weeks into my first job at a smoothie shop, at the tender age of 16, I learned how quickly the mundane can transform into the macabre. The day had been punctuated by pranks. My coworkers' friends had been stopping by regularly, their juvenile jokes and fake scares becoming an annoying but harmless backdrop to our shift. So when the door burst open that night, my first reaction was an internal eye roll, anticipating yet another childish attempt at humor. That assumption evaporated like morning mist when I felt cold metal pressed against my back, and an arm snake around my chest with predatory precision. The robber's voice carried the stereotypical demand, "Give me all the money." But there was nothing cliché about the terror that froze my blood as he forced us toward the back room. The command to kneel and face the wall transformed my world into a nightmare, each heartbeat thundering in my ears like a countdown to what I feared would be my last moments. Time stretched like taffy as I heard him moving closer. In that moment, fate intervened in the form of an unlikely guardian angel, a heavy cart I had left partially blocking the back room door while refilling juices earlier. The robber, his movements erratic and uncoordinated from whatever substance coursed through his system, couldn't navigate past this unexpected obstacle. His frustration manifested in a string of curses before he fled, my coworker's husband giving chase and managing to apprehend him outside. When the police arrived, they discovered his weapon, an industrial-sized pipe wrench, wrapped tightly in his fist, clearly intended as an instrument of blunt force trauma. Years later, a chilling detail emerged that still haunts my dreams. During his subsequent incarceration, he had stabbed his cellmate multiple times. The revelation of his capacity for violence added a new layer of horror to my memories of that night, knowing how close I had come to becoming another victim of his brutality. The incident left deep psychological scars that therapy is still helping me process. To this day, I can't walk through cities at night without constant vigilance, and I never sit anywhere that doesn't give me a clear view of the door. Small adaptations to carry the weight of that night's terror. Sometimes I wonder if that juice cart saved more than just my evening, if its awkward positioning had prevented not just a robbery, but potentially something far more sinister. It's a reminder that sometimes survival hinges on the smallest of circumstances, and that danger can lurk in the most ordinary places, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Story 17. As a lifeguard, I was trained to save others from danger, but one call revealed how easily the rescuer can become the one needing rescue. The emergency alert came from a condominium near the boardwalk, unusual for our beach-focused team, but our proximity to the scene made us the closest responders. The irony of what followed would have been amusing if it hadn't been so potentially lethal. There I was, a professional lifesaver, walking straight into what could have been my final rescue attempt. With my medical kit in hand and the confidence that comes from countless successful interventions, I approached the condo, knocked, announced my presence, and stepped into what could have been a scene from a psychological thriller. Inside, I found a young man, his wrists decorated with dried blood, his eyes holding the vacant stare of someone deep in the grip of drugs or psychosis. As I began my standard assessment questions, my supervisor suddenly appeared like a guardian angel, his hand gripping my shoulder with urgent force as he pulled me from the room. The truth that emerged sent chills down my spine. The man had called in reporting suicidal intentions, but with a darker twist, he had threatened to take anyone who entered with him. I had unwittingly walked into a potential murder-suicide scenario without police backup, breaking every protocol designed to protect first responders. The incident triggered a comprehensive review of our emergency response procedures, but the real lesson was more personal.